Bueno a todos, de nuevo, bienvenidos. Seguimos en Expo Estudiar Online 2020 y acá estoy con Jonathan Wright. Él es el representante de Waterloo Catholic District School Board y es para nosotros un placer tenerlo, ya que con ellos tenemos una cercanía bastante grande. Es uno de los partners de estudiar al cual van muchos estudiantes cada año a programas cortos, programas grandes. Este es un programa de colegio donde pueden hacer primaria, secundaria. Es un programa de lo mejor académicamente a nivel de Canadá, así que pues póngale bastante atención. La charla va a ser en inglés y las preguntas ustedes nos las pueden hacer tanto en español como en inglés en el chat y al final de la charla se las pasaremos a Jonathan para que él las responda. Yo se las paso en inglés, así que no hay ningún problema. So, Jonathan, welcome to Expo Estudiar. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Okay, so I just introduced you so we can start right away.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And it is terrific to be here speaking to you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. The Waterloo Catholic District School Board takes seriously the idea of fostering global leadership in our students. And so I'm excited to share with you a little bit today about how we do that, why we do that, and how the Model United Nations plays a role. We live in an increasingly internationalized world. And so I think more than ever, the ability to encourage in students, the ability to engage with a variety of cultures and experiences, as well as to maintain high standards of academic excellence, is more important than ever. In a global society, knowledge alone is not enough. The practical application of that knowledge in a collaborative and ever-changing setting is the holy grail for us. Our board calls this global leadership, the ability to drive change across borders and between cultures. Our goal is for students to expand their awareness and perspectives through engaging experiences in and outside of the classroom. The Model United Nations program provides a fun and accessible way to pursue these goals, and our graduates are a testament to this success. And so today we'll talk about why I'm here very briefly. I'll introduce myself. We'll talk about what global leadership is, why it's important, how the United Nations demonstrates global leadership, and how the Model United Nations delegates develop those skills. I've got some short videos of our students describing their experience, and then as there's time, we'll begin to explore some of those necessary skills for both global leadership and Model United Nations participation. And so I had to think, why would someone ask me to talk about this? I spent much of my high school and university career as a delegate at Model United Nations simulations. When I got to work in high schools, then I was a chair of many simulations. I'm a mentor for students who participate, and I'm also a history and international diplomacy teacher. But I grew up in Liverpool, England. I didn't grow up in Canada. I moved to Canada when I was 11 years old. And I say that because living in Liverpool at the time was a very rooted experience. I had this very clear experience of what it meant to be Liverpudlian. Most of it had to do with the football. But it wasn't that I was English, it was a different sense. And I think a lot of what we want to talk about today is moving from that sense of local rootedness, that sense that I belong only in this place, to the idea that maybe I belong to a bigger community. One of our former prime ministers in Canada, Stephen Harper, talked about the somewheres and the anywheres. He said there is an older generation who see themselves as somewheres. They imagine themselves only in that place and at that time. But that there's a new generation of people who, connected by social media, the World Wide Web, see themselves as anywheres. They connect anywhere. And for those, they would argue that we no longer have the luxury of thinking that local actions do not have global consequences. We talk about COVID-19. If nothing else, current events and indeed history have always reminded us that we are connected globally. But innovations in connectivity, so we talk about the telephone, to satellites, to the internet, to social media and beyond, have accelerated and amplified the effect beyond anything my father could have imagined growing up in England during the Second World War. The current pandemic brings front and center the challenges of setting domestic or national policies in light of global events. In Canada, we're still feeling the impact of COVID-19. We're 3 weeks into our school year and we're still nervous. Our lives don't look the same way that they used to, but there's this general sense that we're managing. Our direct neighbor to the south, however, has an entirely different experience, and an experience that causes the longest land border in the world, which has almost always throughout our history been open, to be largely closed. Families are split, cross-border workers are inconvenienced, and the political perspective of our two countries has never been more different. Colombia too suffers, but your experience is set against a much different cultural, economic, and political backdrop than Canada. The news reports tell us in Canada that there's a civic challenge as unrest builds regarding the peace deal, union rights, Indigenous lives, and cuts to public education. You know so much more than I do, or ever will, about what it means to be Colombian today. But I can only imagine the additional challenges and stressors that you live with when trying to also manage a pandemic that's taken over 21,000 lives. And still the impact is felt around the world. In Canada, we've moved schools to 50% remote or online learning, at least in high schools. We've been able to provide poor families with computers and internet access, and I understand you're doing something similar. But in India, where a significant amount of a massive population of 1.3 billion live below the poverty line, such access is impossible. A country in which access to elementary public education was already a challenge for rural communities has now made access to learning a choice between risking one's life, and it is a risk, the health system just can't keep up, or going to school. But that individual domestic policy has an impact on the world's ability to respond. When one country is a hotspot, it brings risks for all, not just in the spread of COVID, but for example, in the way global resources are distributed towards COVID and away from things like responding to measles, to Ebola, to cholera, where in places like Western Africa, they still kill annually more than COVID-19 has. This isn't to say being a globalist or a localist is the right point of view. But in both cases, we must admit that there are international consequences. And the challenges continue. Some countries want to close borders to protect their own, to isolate from the outside world. They see a national focus as the path to success, and they want to claim a share of what they believe is a finite amount of prosperity. They build walls. Others see the advantage of interconnectedness. They believe that when all of us, and especially the least amongst us, prosper, we all succeed. They want to build bridges. Pope Francis is the most notable of this. But the fact that it's Pope Francis illustrates the advantage of a non-national point of view, rather than domestic responsibilities. The question is, can a domestic policy, can policy in Canada, can policy in Colombia, can policy in India be served by improving access to the rest of the world? As the standard of living the world around grows, does that make my life better? This is the view the United Nations takes. And all of this is set against a backdrop of global issues that begin, but certainly do not end with climate change, human rights, and racial injustice. And these issues interact with one another. They amplify one another. We know, for instance, with climate change, that the people most likely to first experience harm are those who are already vulnerable. We know that in terms of suppression of protest, the people who are first suppressed are most often minorities. It's a crazy world, and I don't say that to be dismissive. But it was a similar world that the United Nations began with in 1945. It was a world that was devastated by 2 world wars, a global pandemic, a Great Depression. The acceleration of global connection through transport, trade, and colonialism had shown an incredibly dark and even evil side. And world leaders hoped that providing a venue for collective security, dialogue between nations, and international structures to enhance the standards of living around the world might avoid similar recurrences. This hasn't always been the case, and the action or the inaction of the UN has certainly contributed to this struggle. Again, we find ourselves in a time of pandemic, of financial and economic recession, and there's no shortage of war around the world. Yesterday celebrated the 75th anniversary of the formation of the United Nations. And world leaders met, largely by video conference, given our new reality, to speak. President Trump had his point of view, President Xi of China had his point of view, and it prompted the Secretary General, the leader of the United Nations, to comment, "We are moving in a dangerous direction. Our world cannot afford a future where the 2 largest economies split the globe in a great fracture, each with its own trade and financial rules, and internet and artificial intelligence capacities. A technological and economic divide risks inevitably turning into a geostrategic and military divide. We must avoid this at all costs. The world we find ourselves in needs international cooperation more than ever." And so the UN then has 5 aims. And these 5 aims hold great promise when pursued with an openness to change and a willingness to share power and influence. And I admit those are not easy conditions. The emphasis has shifted over the years, but the basic belief remains that if people have what they need, if their standard of living removes the nearness of death that comes with poverty, then the roots of conflict can be plucked out. If those roots still remain and begin to grow, then providing a venue for dialogue and discussion, for the promotion of international standards, can cut them off before they blossom. And finally, in worst case scenarios where physical conflict erupts, an international peacekeeping force can provide protection for the innocent, for displaced persons, for refugees and the poor, who are so often the first and constant victims. And so it's into that world that a student looking to develop capacities for global leadership steps. The model United Nations simulates the activity of the real United Nations, with all of its possibility and with all of its limitation. The student acting as a delegate then plays the role of one of the partners in the UN. There are 193 member states and over 500 more non-governmental organizations. There are lots of roles for delegates to play, and all bring with them their own unique learning. Delegates research and write position papers. They debate and discuss in committees. They take decisions in crisis scenarios. A crisis scenario is a case study in which you role play an emergency, like a disease outbreak or a war, and then you problem solve it together. They script resolutions, declarations, and conventions that respond to pressing real world issues. And throughout this, the delegate must represent fairly and accurately the political structures, the foreign and domestic policies, and the cultural perspectives of their delegation, which is most often a country. It requires great skill and a great amount of confidence. But beyond that, it's also having fun, and it really is a lot of fun. Delegates consistently show a variety of outcomes, and these are the outcomes that characterize global leadership. The academic skills of research, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, And that research then prompts an engagement, a global engagement. There's an old saying, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. We only need to look at the world in order to be engaged with its struggles. And once I'm engaged, I'm then called to advocate, to challenge the status quo, to seek a better way. And if I'm willing to do that, I necessarily develop an intercultural competency. I need to understand that my worldview is not the only worldview. Now, these are outcomes, but it does warrant saying that our point of view isn't that we are giving the skills of global leadership to students, but rather we're fostering them, we're developing them. For us, the student already has the built-in capacity to change the world. Our goal is not to inspire leaders who will change the world 20 years from now. It's to recognize the leadership that already exists in students and give them opportunities to advocate and to lead the change now. Matthew's one of these.
My name is Matthew Bond, and I was lucky enough to participate in Model United Nations last year. I started out thinking that Model UN was an event for learning or for improving public speaking skills. I soon found out that it was so much more than that. Model UN is an event for deeper learning about countries that you probably never would have learned about, or for feeling like you resolved the world issue, or for just socializing with people with the same interests as you. I guarantee you that Model UN will have something for you. Everyone goes into the meetings nervous, but then everyone leaves satisfied. The reason for this is because there is no winner. There's only a solution that everyone contributed to. You don't see things like that in life very often. I think Model UN is something really special. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
I love Matthew. Matthew came to us in grade 10. He thought, I'll just take a chance. And within his first year, he'd won multiple awards for being an outstanding delegate. Again, we're simply looking to develop the abilities that are in people, to give students the capacity, the practice to refine what is already an innate capability. So what are some of those skills that we're looking to practice? The first one is research. Now, these aren't an accidental outcome. They're an intentional goal, and it parallels our desire for social, global, and engagement. But it doesn't just rest with the educated. Malala Yousafzai, who's a Pakistani activist and educator that you may well know, was the youngest Nobel laureate ever. She was only in high school when she rose to prominence. But we do know that education helps. We know that elementary education, for instance, especially for young women, is the silver bullet that drives social justice, economic growth, and personal independence. So while we're not suggesting that it's only the educated, only the elite that can change the world, we are saying that those skills help. So for instance, with research, delegates need to be able to identify what their country looks like. Not their country where they live, but the country that they represent. What's its demography? Who are its people? What are its political structures? How does it generate wealth? What are its policies, its history with a specific issue? So I'll give you an example from Canada. Canada has a checkered past with its Indigenous communities. Canada as a nation has not always, and in fact has not often, treated its Indigenous people with respect and with trust. So recently, a group of Indigenous peoples, the Wet'suwet'en, were challenging a trans-provincial oil pipeline that crossed over their territory. Now, if you were playing Canada, you would have to understand a few things. Canada is a nation, it's a big country. It's the second largest land mass in the world. But that country is divided into 10 autonomous and independent provinces and 3 territories. That layered on top of that are treaty rights that give Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples autonomy over certain parts of that land. And that all of this is compounded by the fact that the vast majority of our population live within 200 kilometers of the border with the United States. So this issue I'm talking about, for instance, would require understanding that one province wanted an oil pipeline that crossed another province who didn't want it. And in both cases, went across indigenous land who those tribes were not asked whether or not they would consent. The federal government was asked to decide, and it broke down. Now, this sounds like a domestic issue. Why do I care? Well, maybe there are issues that are similar in Colombia that you can think of, but it does have global implications. For instance, Canada, as a foreign policy, has always positioned itself as a middle power, as an honest broker between the bigger nations. But when it comes to issues of Indigenous rights, we lose the ability to speak. There's something called the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Persons, and only 3 nations haven't signed it: Canada, America, and Australia. And not for nothing, those are 3 nations with the record of probably greatest abuses against their First Nations. So if I were representing Canada in a Model United simulations, I would need to understand all of those different levels so that I could accurately represent. Once we know who we're representing, the next skill is critical thinking. And delegates need to be able to evaluate issues. They need to be able to determine what's in the interests of their individual delegation and what are the international causes and consequences. What are the natural partners that exist around the world? How do non-governmental partners play into this? Multinational corporations, social organizations. In Canada, racial equity is a good example of this, because beyond our treatment of Indigenous persons, we've historically been hostile to immigration. In the 1920s, we passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. We didn't even try to hide what it was trying to do. And even in recent times, when we position ourselves as being more welcoming, we still have a merit-based system that values certain things that excludes populations from developing countries. Well, if I were thinking critically about this question of racial equity and how that's playing its way around the world with the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-colonial structures, I also need to think critically about history versus story. Many of those minority communities were excluded from the political process up until recently, or in fact may still be excluded. And so when I go looking and thinking through the questions of how these issues relate, I need to recognize that the story of many of those excluded communities is not always a part of our history. And so how do we start to bring those things together? How do we start to work to international conclusions? We look at what was happening in the Middle East and the diaspora of refugees fleeing conflict and war. We have students at my school, St. Mary's, who on 5 minutes notice were told to pack a bag and start walking. And they walked for days to a refugee camp and then finally made their way to Canada. How do we account for those experiences? How do countries set individual national targets that respond to the global call? And a global call, which, by the way, is only going to grow greater given climate change. That the peoples of coastal communities experiencing rising sea levels and drought, South Africa and Johannesburg is a great example, are needing to move elsewhere. How do we understand this? Well, it's time to think critically about it. And once I can start unpacking that issue, then I need to collaborate. And so as a delegate, I would work with partners and competitors in order to develop effective solutions. I'll use another example here, Canada's issue with resources. We have massive resources in Canada. And much of the land that those resources come from is Indigenous owned, but the extraction of it is done by multinational corporations. Those resources aren't distributed equally. How do we start to decide what's appropriate and what's not? Can we any more afford to prop up fossil fuel industries? Can we afford not to prop up fossil fuel industries as an opportunity to help developing nations further their own economic capacity? I think this is the most important skill. You don't need to be the smartest or the most expert person in the room, but you do need to know how to cooperate, to challenge people in their thinking, and to work towards the identification and the pursuit of common goals. So who are the stakeholders and what are they looking for? So in this instance, certainly money plays a part. But Canada wants the tax revenue. The Indigenous peoples are looking for an economic windfall to help raise their communities out of poverty. The corporations want profits for their shareholders. But sustainability is also a question. If we can't engage in that extraction in a world that doesn't cripple the planet, the money is short-term at best. How do we respect the autonomy of those individual communities? And how do we do so in a way that avoids conflict? I had a professor once who said conflict only comes from three places: voice, you're not listening to me; values, I believe this is right or wrong; and resources, you have something and I need it. If we can determine where the points of tension are in a committee, if we can identify those common goals, those outcomes we desire, we may argue about how to get there, but at least we know where we're pursuing. And one can see the benefit of this in all of our academic life, as well as our social life. And finally, students need to be able to communicate, to express their ideas in a way that's diplomatic, in a way that's respectful. I was just having a conversation with my class yesterday. We said the model that we offer as adults today to young people is not one that says argument, disagreement can be neutral. That I can disagree with you and still respect where you come from. That I can speak diplomatically to you without indicting, without calling into question your character or your belief. That the media is flooded with people who say, if you disagree with me, you are wrong, and therefore you are a bad person. The Model United Nations gives people the opportunity to develop their voice, but to also learn how to respect the voices of others, to collaborate in written communication, whether it's position papers, resolutions, or treaties, and to communicate orally, to speak well and with confidence for the skill that we have. Another student who did this so well came to us very young. He was in grade 9 when he joined the Model United Nations, and Jake had great success.
Model UN is an amazing experience that I was able to participate in. It gave me the chance to be a part of a group of people who have genuine care and respect for what we are here to do, and hopefully make a change with a couple of laughs along the way. What's great about Model UN is that it gave me a chance to research and speak to others about the modern world and what is happening so that we can make a difference on a crisis. It changes our whole perspective of looking at the news and seeing politicians making decisions and having conversations by allowing us to do it instead. It gives me and my generation the opportunity to be prepared for the future and to know what it'll be like to be the ones teaching and paving the way for the next generations to come. Model UN is something that changed my life, and it will change yours.
So if I perhaps convinced you that the United Nations has a purpose and that participating in Model United Nations simulations can provide both academic opportunity, social obligations, and also a heck of a lot of fun. And if Matthew and Jacob said anything to you that was interesting, we should talk about how you get involved. Our students participate in several ways. We have school teams that meet regularly to develop skills and discuss events that are going on around the world. We have a course that's dedicated to international diplomacy and uses the skills of the Model United Nations. So if we broke down what was happening in that class, it's probably 15% content being delivered by me, another 35% of students working to learn in areas that interest them, and then 50% of them participating in simulations to practice those skills. And the students would say it's some of the richest learning they have because they have the freedom to practice, to make mistakes, to try, and to live their learning, as opposed to simply listening for their learning. Our local school board hosts simulations where schools will get together as a team and participate. There are large-scale ones that are offered through universities, think tanks, or other organizations. And that offers a great partnership with politicians and other speakers who can come in and address the concerns that they see in the world and provide opportunities to students for a bigger worldview. But the one I'll suggest to you is that our school board next year intends to host a large-scale international event. Now, one opportunity would be, provided that we're in a different place, for delegations to come from countries like Colombia or others in person as part of a bigger cultural experience, but also to participate digitally. There are many limitations of this world we're in now over the screen, but we've had several simulations already using this technology that's allowed our students to remain at home but still participate. There's no reason that that couldn't be extended beyond there. So finally, as a former participant and on behalf of the hundreds of students in our school board who regularly participate, I have to say that my fondest memories as a student and a teacher are from simulations and teams like this. I enjoyed my classes, I played tons of sports, but the skills and experiences of the Model United Nations have played an immense part in forming the person that I am today, and I hope that you will have that opportunity as well. I don't know if there are any questions.
Jonathan, we have a couple of questions. What type of program would you suggest to a person who will engage in foreign affairs or law, but that wants to have like an experience in a high school like the ones you have?
I think that's a terrific question, and there's three things I'd suggest. The first is, I can only speak to the Canadian experience. There are certain courses that are useful. So we have our international diplomacy course, which we wrote and we're very proud of, but international business classes, international law classes, politics classes, world history classes, and economics classes, if you can concentrate there, not just the content, but the skills that those classes offer, really point you in the direction of public service. One of the things we're talking about in our board is how to develop those as a certificate program so that you could be a part of an integrated package. Instead of taking them separately, we can cross over the classes.
Can you comment a little bit? Yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
excuse me,
No,
excuse me.
go ahead.
I thought you had finished. No, no, go on, go on.
I was just going to say, the other things to consider, though, are things like Model United Nations, and that's an international package, right? You can access that from different places where you can practice those skills. And we would call that an extracurricular. And again, those skills carry over. One of the local universities has a team, and we invited their president to come and talk to our students. And she isn't interested in the kinds of classes I just described. She's actually taken biology and chemistry. But for her, her interest in science doesn't exclude her interest in the political world around her. The final thing I'll say is that different countries have different requirements. So in Canada, because we're a bilingual country, it is a must for you to enter the Canadian civil service that you speak both English and French. So there are lots of students who would want to go into that world and to write the exam to get in, but they can't because they can't speak one or the other of the languages. So that would be something I can't speak to Colombia, but that you would want to look into if you were seriously thinking of moving in that direction.
Okay.
Sorry, Carlos.
No, it's okay. Jonathan, can you comment a little bit on the first diploma that you mentioned? I mean, what is it like? What's the duration of the diploma? How long does it take to do it? Can a Colombian student do it?
For sure. And so that's something that we're building at the moment. So right now we offer those courses. And so a student, whether it was a student in Canada in our catchment area or a student who was part of an international experience, they could take law, economics, etc. But they take those classes separately. Our goal is in the next year or two to package those together so that if I have you for economics and international diplomacy and law, for example, that instead of it being three separate classes, then we can start to think of that as one big class and integrate the activities. So that's not something that we offer at the moment, but it's something that we're looking at offering. And certainly through our office here at the school board, we can talk about the possibility for international participation.
Okay, there is another question. I will try to translate it.
Sure.
What is the importance of Canada for the UN in terms of academics?
If I'm understanding the question, it's how do academics help Canada's participation in the UN? Or am I misunderstanding the question?
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So in order to have access to the United Nations as a representative of a country, you need to be delegated by we call it the Foreign Office, but international affairs from that country. And most countries will not admit you to that world without a minimum university experience. And so on the one hand, it's your ticket in the door, right? You need to be a university graduate. But the people who do it best are the people who have a wide range of experiences and who possess those skills that we talked about rather than just the courses in particular. What I mean by that is in Canada, I have to sit an exam. But the exam assesses my ability to think critically, my experience in terms of what I understand around the world, as opposed to a particular set of content. And so our academic preparation focuses more on skill than it does on the specifics, for instance, of a specific history course set. I don't know if that addresses the question.
Yeah, part of, yes. I think that the question was more, I mean, the UN has some countries that have more importance than others
Oh, okay.
in terms of different, I mean, topics.
Yeah.
But Canada especially has regulations and educational treaties with countries like Colombia. So I think the question was more intended to be like, how is or what is the importance of Canada being in the UN
Right.
regarding educational topics?
Oh, okay. Canada historically, since World War II, has recognized that we are not the same economic player as countries like America or like China or the Soviet Union for 50 years. And so they tried to be, we called it a middle power, an honest broker, and to encourage other countries to develop the capacity for self-determination. There are ways we do that through foreign aid. There are ways we do that through putting proposals forward in the United Nations. One of the shifts in Canada's foreign policy recently has been more to attempt to be supportive of the proposals of individual countries than to try and drive their own proposals. I don't know about in Colombia, but in Canada and America right now, there's a lot of talk of the impact of colonialism and the idea that other countries and other people, and certainly these dominant minorities, decide for a massive amount of majorities. And Canada kind of fell into that historically, where the idea was we know what's best for you, so let's tell you what should happen. And so they've really tried to move to a point of view where let the individual countries decide, and then we can support you in that. And that's one of the goals of the UN, right? Is that except for the Security Council, where 5 countries have veto power, everybody should be equal. And so as a simple illustration, in any kind of committee work, if I want to make a proposal, you would need to second that proposal, right? You second the motion, you say this is worth our time. In the United Nations, that's not necessary because that means someone else has a say over what I think is important. So when it's done well, everybody has a voice. To challenge that though, this is the 75th anniversary today and yesterday. 52 people will have spoken before the president of Slovenia speaks. The president of Slovenia will be the first woman to address the General Assembly this year. So we can talk about equality, but we need to recognize how we determine who gets to speak makes it real.
Okay, okay. What do you think? I mean, in terms of a CV, a curriculum for a student, what do you think is the importance to be part of the UN models in their countries, or maybe if they want to go to Waterloo, be part of this program?
For me, the importance is in classrooms, sometimes it's easy to say these are just ideas. The Model United Nations, or at least the goal of it, is to give you a chance to live that learning. My dad's a plumber by trade, and I've got to change a toilet in my house this weekend. He's not telling me how to do that. He's standing there with me and showing me and then letting me do it so that I can learn by doing. And I think by analogy, that's what the Model United Nations does, is it gives students the opportunity to practice as opposed to just hold the theory in their head. And if you're that kind of person, have a lot of fun doing
it. Okay. Okay. Do you guys have like a specific type of program that concentrates on the UN model or that has UN model like a way of teaching?
Yes. So I teach history by trade. I use for a day in my grade 10 Canadian history class, we'll do a simulation. But in grade 12, so age 17, 18, we have a whole course that's built around international diplomacy. So we start by doing in a little more depth just what we've talked about, the purpose of the UN, the history of the UN, how the UN's made up. But the bulk of the class is looking at what are the global issues that are driving the world right now, and we investigate those issues. What are the parts of the UN that address it, right? So for instance, if you look at what's happening in South Africa, in Johannesburg, there's a massive drought. And the average person, who not for nothing tends to be Black, has no access to water. The rich gated communities, like literally with security guards and gates around them, are shipping in water by the truck in order to live the lifestyle they want to live. And there's a huge issue with how that water is being used, what it means for everybody, people attacking the water trucks. So we would take that issue and we would say, let's go out and research. Who are the different people involved in this? What are the different points of view? What do we need to know that we don't know already? And then we would look at a simulation that would debate how to respond to that. From there, we would say, great, so what would that look like at the UN? Well, we would need to look at an organization like UNESCO, which would look at questions of economics and social integration. Great, so who sits at that table? What are the things they do? What's their history of addressing issues like that? And the students are the ones who lead that. which I think is where Matthew and Jake would say that's the advantage. Because I'm not telling them this is what you should do. I'm just providing the guardrails, right? So that as they figure it out, it's their learning, they own it. And that's where I think you get the real uptake on the part of students.
Okay. Okay, there is another question. I mean,
Sure.
how do you think a Colombian student will benefit from the international education that Canada or Waterloo gives or offers?
So I'm going to be careful on this because I would never say what the benefit is for someone in a country I've never visited, right? Like I need to recognize that. I do think, though, that the skill-based focus that we have here is useful for everybody. Now, that doesn't assume that you don't have a similar focus in your schools. I don't know. But what I can say is that the skill-based focus engages our students and the international students who come to visit us in a way that the traditional content-driven learning doesn't. Right?
Okay.
I want to be careful about saying what you need, right? That's the point, as I don't know. So we
That,
learn together.
that's okay. I know you haven't visited Colombia, and that this is one of my questions. Do you think, I mean, because you're a like historical professor and you teach all those subjects, do you think Colombia will be closer to Canada in the time to come?
I, I think it's a really tough question. We have a big movement in Canada right now to the localism I talked about, right? The
Hmm.
world seems to be breaking up. My family in Britain were very supportive of Brexit, right? Britain shouldn't be part of Europe. It doesn't matter about the economic and the social benefit. We want to take care of ourselves. America is very much in that mindset right now. I think the world is in that moment, and it's a really big challenge. So I'm not sure globally that unless something changes, anybody will be integrating the way they used to. I do think, though, that North America, Central America, South America have common enough experiences in terms of European influence and the negatives that came with it that we could find common outcomes and common experiences. And hopefully through things like this, I would love, I mean, I teach the class next semester. I'd love if there was a Colombian class who wanted to, partner with us, join us, and we can Skype in and talk. And I think that's part of the crossing cultural boundaries, not just at the UN level, but at a very personal level, that offers the hope. If I know your story, it's so much harder for me to just dismiss you and your concerns and your way of life.
Yeah,
Um,
let's pin on that idea that you have. Maybe we could do something with the teachers and counselors that are visiting today our fair, because we could do something like that to have peers for their students in Colombia and for your students in Colombia, and maybe do something like that. That would be awesome.
absolutely,
That would be
absolutely.
awesome.
And I mean, in this world right now, that's
Yeah,
probably all we can do, right? Like, I'd love to
yeah,
visit Colombia. I can't get on a plane right now. But
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
opportunity doesn't mean that we can't connect, right? So I would love it. I would absolutely love it if someone was interested in that.
And maybe you can talk to the directors to send you to Colombia to see our reality from yourself.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
what do you think? I mean, as you're a very smart guy and work in that field, what do you think uh, would be like the best tools that the students in a developing country like Colombia should like hold on for a bright career or a bright future?
There's a saying that's popular up here right now
Okay.
that God distributes talent equally, but he doesn't distribute opportunity equally. And I
Okay.
think the focus on talent, right? What are those skills that everybody possesses, right? This idea that students need to wait to change the world, that I need to tell them how to do that, we've screwed it up, right? Like we're part of the problem and part of the solution. But the students right now are the ones who need to take the reins. And so that idea that if I can take the time myself to get to know another culture, to come to understand other people, if I can develop those skills which will help me in the future and right now make change, that's what's going to drive it. Everybody has the ability to do that. It's how do you access the opportunities? And so if you've got students sitting around, I would hope they're fired up and they're going to say to their teachers, can we try it? Right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but you can just go on the internet and download, a 10-minute little lesson on how to try a simulation. And you give it a go and you say, wow, that was cool. Let's try it a little bit more.
Okay. And the last question,
Sure.
talking about the region, the Waterloo region, what do you say, or what can you tell us about the region that is like extremely beneficial or extremely important for a student to choose Waterloo region or your programs
Yeah,
instead of choosing a different one in Canada or in the
for
world?
sure. There's easy answers, right?
I
We
know.
have
Let's go
three
for the difficult ones.
Yeah. Well, the easy ones are we've got three universities within 20 minutes of us. So our schools connect with those universities. The schools are a great pathway to those universities, all of that. We've got great cultural opportunities and all of those kind of things. But I would say, quite honestly, it's changed in the last 20 years, but our biggest strength right now is our diversity. So I teach at St. Mary's. We have 2,200 or so students. We speak 72 different languages. We have students from over 60 countries. We have newcomers. We have people who've been part of Canada for generations. We have First Nations here. And it's that mixing of culture and experience that makes me never want to leave that school. Like, I've taught in lots of schools. My own high school was we all looked the same, right?
Yeah.
But what Waterloo region has become is a hub, not just for newcomers who are looking for a new life in Canada, but for people who are coming from different countries to work at the universities, at the local think tanks. And so it's really rich from that point of view. So you would certainly get your taste of Canada. We'll take you to a Blue Jays game to watch some baseball and those kind of things. But you do get a sense of the world in Canada that you might not get elsewhere.
Okay, that's good. Thank you very much. And just a quick a quick thing to say goodbye to all. Just an advice for young people in Colombia, from your point of view.
Yeah. Be confident in yourself. I've never met a student who didn't have the capacity to change the world. I've met lots of students who don't believe that they have the capacity to change the world. And so if you believe in yourself and you develop those skills consciously and you have some fun doing it, the world has got a chance.
Okay, very good. So, Jonathan, thank you very much from all of us in Estudiar, in Expo Estudiar, and all of the attendees here. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you and your program here. And let's see if we can see each other here in Colombia soon, or in Canada maybe.
In Canada and Colombia, or at a minimum online. Let's make it
Yeah,
happen.
yeah, of course.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Take care.
Gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Espero hayan disfrutado tanto esta charla como yo. Los veo en la próxima charla, nos vemos en las próximas charlas. Recuerden visitar el stand de Waterloo, que está en la pestaña de pabellones. Se van para High Schools y ahí van a encontrarlo, y van a encontrar representantes que les van a dar toda la información acerca de los programas tan interesantes que pueden hacer para su currículum internacional. Un abrazo para todos y nos despedimos por ahora. Un abrazo. Bye, John.
Bye bye now.